What?
Ladies and gentlemen, and variations thereof, welcome to the Selectives Lorecast, a casual Elder Scrolls podcast. Today we're talking about the Unreliable Narrator. We've done this before. We've been here before. Time has looped back around again. Actually, we only spent like 45-something minutes on it way back. Like, if you've been with the series since the beginning, first off, how old are you? Secondly, congratulations. Third, this is a, we are repeating, like, I think it might have been one of the first or second casts we ever did.
It was the first one.
It was,
number one.
Yeah, literally the first one we ever did. And the reason why we're doing it again is because the first time around, it was the early Selectives Lorecast, and we were scatterbrained and very unorganized, and we just sort of decided to talk about it off the top of our heads. And, oh god. Bye, people.
All right, Felix, you're last.
And so we didn't really have a chance to actually do it, like, do some actual work on it. Felix just got here. Hello, you guys.
Yes.
You're just in time for the introduction. So my name is Rotten Deadite. With me today are...
Oh, perfect.
Sefri, also known as John.
I am Andrew, also known as the White Guar in Space.
I am James, also known as Aramithius, taking a vacation in Vardenfell because I can. I mean, there's nowhere else I can go at the moment.
Yeah.
And I am the scruffy Lord Felix himself, also known as Banu Hana Masaishi, currently in self-isolation.
Yeah, we're
You're
all
calling
really
scruffy looking.
pale.
You scruffy looking nerf herder.
Yeah,
Exactly.
scruffy looking. Yeah, and so we're for those of you watching this on, like, in the archives, in the 22nd century, this is during the great 2020 toilet paper wars, and we're all just barely hanging on to our sanity. Everybody's eating nothing but ramen. Amazon.com has taken over the entire U.S. economy. And as it turns out, Norman Reedus and the Funky Fetus was actually a predictive, work of futuristic fiction that has now come true. And yeah,
It's a terrible
we're
time
crying
to be
because
alive,
it's true.
I'm having a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, every delivery man is now a hero, and
Yeah.
and a lot of people are starting to finally have serious second thoughts about paying these people minimum wage, because it turns out they're important.
Yeah.
Who knew?
Good. Bless you.
Congrats.
Gotta
It's spreading.
expel that. I
Hang
gotta
up.
expel the Rona demon.
Yeah, that's right. So
Spirits of Sancti, whatever.
Yeah,
we actually
boys,
did like
the
a lot of
unreliable
research
narrator.
before this.
Yes.
James and I actually did a really, like, more James, let's be honest, that did a really good job of going over the core of what we're going to talk about today, which is intrinsically the idea was to start off with the concept of the unreliable narrator. And before we go off on a giant, long rant about what that is, let's talk about why it's important for the Elder Scrolls. One of the things that differentiates Elder Scrolls lore from every other work of, almost every other work of fiction, most certainly the dominant amount of works of fiction, and certainly the dominant number of video games, is that the Elder Scrolls does not have a god narrator, an all-knowing narrator. Everything that's told to you about the Elder Scrolls universe is told to you from the point of view, from the voice of a person who lives in that universe, which means that everything you read, every story, every explanation, every book, every piece of paper or whatever, is written by somebody with, whether they know it or not, an agenda and biases and ignorance as well as knowledge. And what that means in literary terms is that the Elder Scrolls universe is a narrative being told from something called the unreliable narrator, which is a concept in fiction where the narrator of your storyline, again, either is, what do we come down to? A liar, just straight out lying to you because they have, as I said earlier, motivations or opinions, or they're racist or whatever. Or they're trying to manipulate you. Naive in the respect that they don't know what they're talking about. either by choice or by accident. A bragger, in the case of Vivek. A madman, also in the case of Vivek. And a clown. Those are kind of the archetypes that we came up with for unreliable narrators. A clown, obviously somebody who's trying to entertain you, who's lying, but they're lying because they want to make it a funny story. A madman in the respect that, but calm down, Shiogorath fans. I mean, actually insane people. Anything you read from, what was it? Was it the Emmerich? I think the Mad King of Solitude.
Yes, that sounds about right.
Not Emmerich. That
Not
would
Emmerich.
be Pelagius the Third.
Pelagius III. Thank you.
Pelagius.
Thank you very much.
Pelagius,
That dude was out of his fucking mind, and that's exactly what we're talking about. Anything you read from that guy, if you had a book in Skyrim or something that was from Pelagius III, and it was just pages after page after page of Wabbajack, and then on the last page there was something about how his maid is trying to steal all his oranges. Then you're going to read that last page and you're going to go, probably his maid isn't trying to steal his oranges, probably. And that's how you know that you're reacting to the unreliable narrator concept. And what makes the Elder Scrolls, our Elder Scrolls Caligula, a little bit that less nooky, probably. And it's one of the reasons why, that's one of the things that differentiates the Elder Scrolls universe from other universes, from other narratives, is that it has, at no point in the Elder Scrolls universe are you ever being told anything from an absolute authority. Nobody. The closest we get to a creation myth with any remarkable amount of detail is the Vivek wheel model of, how the universe was created and why the universe was created and etc. kind of comes from Vivek's idea of the creation of the universe. And so a lot of Elder Scrolls lore nerds, including this one, tend to take that as we kind of think of it as gospel, and that's a mistake, because if for no other reason, even if Vivek was being completely honest with us when he was writing their storyline, which is highly unlikely, at the very least it was coming from a person who was raised from Velothi culture. In other words, a person who was learning about the creation of the universe from a standpoint of the distrust of the Aedra and the trust of the Daedra. So you still have to, and as similar as Vivek's wheel model holds up to other creation myths in the Elder Scrolls universe, all we're really seeing here is just common themes among a collection of myths, all of which have it in some way or in some respect wrong. So let me catch up with myself here. Okay, so I tend to, I like to think that I'm known in this in Elder Scrolls, in the Elder Scrolls lore community, as being a guy who reads way too much into absolutely everything. And
I'm sorry, did you say New Whirling School?
Yeah. Hashtag NewOrleansSchool.com. And one of the things that I like to take from the unreliable narrator stuff. Well, James, do you want to talk a little bit about what, like, the unreliable narrator as a philosophical impact, kind of?
As it's basically the core of the concept is basically you can't trust anything that, or not you can't trust anything, but you can't trust what you're being told. That to a degree is in essence saying that you are free to make stuff, well, not exactly free to make stuff up, but that your interpretation will also form part of the world and part of your understanding, which at least Lawrence Schick has brought into quite explicitly.
Right.
He's had, where am I? This absolutely magnificent quote, which
it's a good one.
Load up on my page. That I can't actually search for right this second.
I've got it right in front of me.
Yeah.
These,
yep. Yes.
I don't have a good Lawrence Schick impression. Does anybody have a good Lawrence Schick impression?
I don't think
No, I
anyone.
wish.
We would need like James
Yeah.
Earl Jones to do it.
Kirkbride's
properly.
got a good one.
Yeah, so
Does
you
he?
know,
Does he?
so you know the idea of an objective reality behind all of these different people's opinions is not necessarily the case in the world of Tamriel. So listen to what all these different people have to say, make up your own mind, make up your own beliefs about what you think happened, and you're just as liable since you're playing the world and you're playing a character in the world. What you think happened is as legitimate as what that NPC thinks. So it's in any understanding of the Elder Scrolls world has to really be an exercise in interpretation, because if you take any one account, you're going to be missing 90% of what's going on. You need to engage in some sort of reconstruction and some sort of creation of your own perspective, which is going to be missing some things. You're going to find out that you've been misled somewhere along the line, and something critical about exactly how many spokes are in the wheel and how many gaps and all the rest of it. I'm looking at you, Jigalag, and so you've got to be constantly building this picture and so on. The way I tend to think about it, and John's published a piece on this that I think we agree on most of the particulars, but my idea is you can build on reality by consensus, or reality on what sort of a patchwork that you can kind of pull everything together from. That the idea that what you're seeing in the games, what you're reading in the text in the games, and just kind of synthesizing all of that and producing something that you think is probably reality, but you can't necessarily guarantee is reality. Which gets us into all sorts of things about, well, what how can we say what's real in the games versus the texts and everything else.
And that leads us into the part that really fascinates me about Death of the Author, and we'll get to Death of the Author.
Death of the Author is something different, and we'll come back to that.
But what really gets me excited about the Unreliable Narrator is the idea of how it connects with existentialism. If you don't know what the truth is, and it's effectively impossible to determine what the truth is, you have to start, in order to function properly, you have to start creating a framework to operate in a world or in a reality where you will never know what truth is. And that's part of what existentialism addresses. Although, if I understand correctly, the origins of existentialism, and James will know better than me, weren't really generated for that purpose. As far as I can make out, it literally, existentialism, from what I've read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it was literally started because people were having midlife crises. And they were going, oh God, what is even the point of anything I do? And
Definitely Sartre.
Yeah.
Well, right.
Although I think with Sartre, you can kind of just say he was having a life crisis. It didn't start when he hit 50.
That's fair.
So,
yeah. But you know, it's what we at least in American culture refer to as, and I think it's probably Western culture in general, it's probably safe to say, what we refer to as the midlife crisis is this moment where stereotypically men, but actually everybody, have this moment where they're thinking, I've lived my whole life. I went to school, I went to college, I got a degree, I got a career, I got a car. You may say to yourself, you know,
geez, those all sound like really nice things to have.
How did I get here? You know, and you may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife, and you may say to yourself, "My God, what have I done?" And nobody. Okay, fine. And so one of the things that existentialism tries to address is that moment of when you suddenly realize that nothing you've done that you thought had meaning up to this point actually has any meaning. And existentialism tries to give you one of the many things it does is it tries to give you a framework of beliefs of a system to work with the idea that, yes, nothing has any meaning, and that's okay. Because now you can assign meaning to things. You have the ability to decide for yourself what is important and what isn't. But before you do that, you first have to come to the conclusion that nothing has any meaning. Otherwise, you don't have the freedom to decide for yourself that what has meaning for you and what doesn't.
Aren't we starting to get into like nihilism a little bit there?
Yeah.
The whole nothing has meaning.
Well,
Yep.
what the difference between existentialism and nihilism? There are many differences, but if I understand correctly, and I'm still waiting for James to tell me I'm a fucking idiot, is that
I'll jump up and down if you do.
please
Carry
do
on.
seriously is that nihilism says nothing has any meaning. There's no point to doing anything, so behave appropriately. Existentialism says nothing has any intrinsic meaning, but you can assign meaning to things. And therefore, it is worth assigning meaning to things, because otherwise, existentialism suggests that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to operate functionally if you don't, assign meaning to things, which is a much more constructive, I think, frame of work. Nihilism is one of those philosophies that strikes me as a thing that it's a little bit like objectivism, where people just decide to be nihilists because they think it gives them an excuse to be dicks, and. Well, nothing I do matters anyway, so I'm just going to do whatever the fuck I want. That's not really.
I find that I'm definitely more of, I guess you could say, an existentialist in terms of assigning own meaning.
Yeah.
I would still generally, ultimately, I guess, define myself as a nihilist in the grand scheme of, nothing matters, but have fun with it anyway. But that's not an excuse to be a dick.
Right.
Like,
well,
there's a difference between, like here, like pretend it's a cigarette, nothing matters.
yeah.
The universe is a bitter bitch. There's a difference between that and nothing matters. So eat the cake you want. Go tell someone you love them. Go tell someone to fuck off.
Yeah.
Have fun. Go out for a walk. Take that travel plan you've always wanted to do. Like,
Or
nothing matters. So enjoy life. Try and enjoy life.
Or you could
can.
not. It depends. That's one of the kind of the key things to existentialism is this idea of anxiety, which was originally rendered angst, but that has far too much baggage at this point. To
the
really
word.
think about it.
Yeah.
It's the idea of I could carry on talking with this podcast, or I could go downstairs, grab a kitchen knife, and just stab everything that moves. You can do all that. There's nothing physically stopping you. It's purely the construction of what you think about how things should be done and your situation. The kind that kind of accumulation for the midlife crisis is. What's I can't remember precisely who talked about it, but they call it thrownness. The kind of the way that you are just immediately situated in the world, and that world has meaning and context that's flying around and defines you in the process of what it's doing, which is in some ways a good thing because it means you can function with other people. And but in other ways it means that you don't wind up giving yourself your own meaning that then satisfies you. You live inauthentically, to start using some of Sartre's language.
Yeah.
This is relevant. I think this is relevant to the Elder Scrolls in some ways because just to bring
Doc.
it back. Yes, and Doc
Please
would like
don't
to
stab
remind everyone
people.
that we do neither condone nor inspire the act of going on a stabbing rampage with a kitchen knife or any other hand weapon.
Yes, and we're waving hello. Yeah.
Disavow.
Yeah. Please don't stab people. Yeah.
But
No
within the
promises.
concept of the Elder Scrolls, I'm always fascinated with it. When I was reading through the 36 lessons, I was always fascinated when truth comes up. Truth is blunt force in the 36 lessons, because in order for something to be true, you need to make it so. There is no intrinsic truth with what's going on, so you need to be violent. You need to you need to kind of fashion the world the way you want it, which is a very existentialist way of putting things.
And it's made up probably the bulk of Elder Scrolls meta lore talk for the past 3 or 5 years.
Oh yeah.
Well, the Sermon of the Mace is the one you're talking about, and one of the interesting things that the Sermon of the Mace suggests, or seems to suggest with the language and grammar that it has, which is very weird, is that not only yeah, exactly, Doc. It's literally related to Molag Bal and domination. Is the idea that the truth can be determined for other people by dominating them. Yeah. Which is a grim fucking statement, and unfortunately also tends to kind of ring true in some cases. That it is actually possible for some people to have their reality, their truth determined by force by other people. And which is dreadful, but also it does happen. But one of the other ways I should say that existentialism and so one of the ways that existentialism leads directly into the Elder Scrolls is through a concept called postmodernism, which is a phase in art history, I believe, right?
It's a phase in art history, in literature, in all sorts. It bleeds into philosophy, bleeds into all sorts of concepts. There's part of me that likes to think it started in 1848 simply because one of the lines that describes it so well is in the Communist Manifesto.
Oh.
That's just me. But the line of "all that is solid melts into air" is pretty much describes how postmodernism works. That no concept is solid. You've got and that nothing is fixed, etc., etc., and that's straight in the prologue of Marx's work, kind of describing the conditions of man and stuff.
Yeah.
So,
and it fits into the postmodernism art movement. Can we encapsulate it in a way? It's if I understand it correctly, it's the idea is that all art should be interpreted by the viewer, and that the artist's intentions are either irrelevant or harmful, depending on who's interpreting it, are either irrelevant or harmful to the viewer's experience.
Yeah, I don't think I would summarize postmodernism in that way. Postmodernism, from what I've seen, seems to be a lot more about deconstructing the framework of what makes art, rather than necessarily being about only the direct interpretation of the viewer. That's that's a much more modern concept that came from the destructuralist movement.
That rings a bell. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's from Barthes, Foucault, and Derrida, and those who came after him.
Oh, what are we doing?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
I mean, is that a good example there?
Yeah.
This is not a pipe.
Yeah, it's not a pipe.
Yes.
And strictly speaking, he's correct. It's an image of a pipe.
Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
yeah. But what it also does is it's a statement that it's an intentional contradiction. It's Magritte saying, telling people who are viewing a pipe their first. I'm trying to keep up with the scenes. It's Magritte telling people you're looking at a photo at a painting of a pipe, and then the text underneath it contradicts, the image that you're viewing. Don't read that much into it, Doc. I hear you, but I don't think we're intentionally doing that. Yeah.
No.
So one of the reasons why postmodernism fits with the Elder Scrolls well is it's sort of it helps encapsulate Lawrence Schick's suggestions about how we should receive our experiences, how we should remember and internalize our experiences in Elder Scrolls games. The idea that there is not supposed to be a definitive way that you should play an Elder Scrolls game. You're not supposed to consume an Elder Scrolls game a specific way. There's no, you don't play, if you say like the only right way to play Skyrim is if you side with the Imperials, you're going to get a lot of great arguments about why that's not true. And they're all valid, and similarly, it's like, for example, in Morrowind, as people will point out, it's incredibly prohibitively difficult to become the head of every single organization that lies in that game.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Thieves Guild and Fighters Guild are mutually exclusive.
Yeah,
There's still a way to do it though, but you have to time it just right.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. You have to very specifically break the game to make that happen. And if you don't know about those,
doing that was fun.
Yeah, if you don't specifically manipulate the game with the intention of doing that, then it's purposefully impossible. And one of the reasons why it's impossible is because the Morrowind developers did not want you to be able to do absolutely everything on your first playthrough. They wanted repeat gameplay.
And great houses notwithstanding, too. I mean, you can't be the head of all great houses.
Until you are named Hortator and Nerevarine.
Yeah, well, and even then, you're still just Hortator. You're not actually the head.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, fine, you're allowed to be Hortator. That's it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you're allowed to tell us what to do, but you don't get the house. You don't get the cool house.
Yeah. Okay, fine. You don't get the cool mushroom house or the bug house, but still, it kind of counts. You're still technically a member of each house.
Still technically, yeah, technically, and still counts. And that's Hortator, yeah. That's the Warframe guild that I used to be in, Hortator. We're all whores for taters.
I was in it for about 12 seconds too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had because don't get me started. All right.
Warframe cast when?
Don't tempt me, Frodo. So we're kind of whipping through this pretty quick, but one of the things
I have plenty to add, but keep going. I don't want to stop you. You're on a train. Yeah. Let's do it.
No, let's slow down a little bit, because part of the point of this is to explore this with more detail. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So to simultaneously date this episode and to also make it hopefully relevant for other people who might just be getting into the Elder Scrolls community or into the meta lore, as it were. A really good example, like a good contemporary example of the unreliable narrator, is in the film Joker. Because we're introduced to this guy and his worldview, and we're revealed, like, without saying too many spoilers, about a third to halfway into the movie, that we can't trust a lot of his experiences. We get a direct contradiction of this. And all of a sudden that makes you question, well, okay, what else was real or wasn't real that we've seen so far? And then that leaves the ending open to interpretation. Did that really happen, or was that in his head? And that's how he imagined it and how his soul wanted it to be. But that was his reality. That we're seeing from his perspective, and it's
that's a really good example.
Yeah,
I mean,
but like I said, now
American Psycho is another
one. Future, after the toilet paper wars are over, people are going to say, "Oh well, that old."
And I hesitate to ascribe the madman kind of moniker to that, because I mean it's also kind of a narrative on mental illness too, and so I don't want to say people with mental
social disadvantage.
I mean, it's a brilliant film, but I mean that's definitely one of those situations where the unreliable narrator is most palpable. And I've had a conversation with people. I had a talk about unreliable narrator with Zarek Zakaron a few months ago. Yeah. And,
wait, what?
It is possible. It is possible to have a decent conversation with that guy.
Zarek's great.
I mean, he's civil enough when you're on one-to-one. But he was trying to explain to me how the unreliable narrator is a device that applies to individual characters, and how, so for example, Joker, the main character, is that character. He is the one narrating the entire story, and maybe I'm sure you could find examples of like Ophelia in Hamlet can be kind of an unreliable narrator, because she gets her madness from how Hamlet's reacting. So it's usually something that's ascribed to a single character, but in the Elder Scrolls, it's a blanket concept. Because it's kind of mimicking real life. Something I normally say when I'm explaining this concept to people and elsewhere is that, if you were to ask me about the life and times of Genghis Khan, I could probably give you some accurate things, but I'm not going to be able to give you, objective facts 100% of the time about Genghis Khan. Like it's not going to happen. I am not an expert. And there's no reason for you to take what I have to say about it, as gospel truth. It's just not going to happen. And so, I mean, the same applies to all these characters, every single character, every single source within the confines of the Elder Scrolls. It's the same thing. People don't know what they don't know necessarily.
Right.
And that adds a certain depth to not just the characters, but the universe as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
No one is equally sorry.
No, carry on.
I was gonna say no one is equally unreliable though. That's the
Yes.
that's the
Oh,
thing
absolutely.
That's something I see. I see a lot of people that try to say, "Oh, well, this is true because unreliable narrator." It's like,
I mean, people try to say, "Oh, well, Vivek's a known liar, so everything he says is a lie." I mean, not necessarily. That's not always the case. Yes, we have to take it with a grain of salt. We have to be prepared to say, "Oh, this thing is false," but we can't say it's false simply because we know he has lied in the past. Like that's it's kind of a balance, you know. I mean, if Fear tells me something about, I don't know, some magical property or something, like I'm more inclined to believe him because he's fucking Fear. Let's be honest here.
He'd probably know.
He was our first daddy.
Yeah. And then you know, if Fargoth came to walk up.
Caius Cosades definitely was the first daddy.
Yeah, Muscle Hobo was definitely the first one.
Muscle Hobo, or Crassius Curio.
Yeah.
No, he's not a daddy. He's a simp.
Everyone's just making gags, and I'm just trying to think. Yes,
sorry.
But anyway, so I mean, if Fargoth were to give me some information that contradicts what Diveth Fear was going to say, I'd err in favor of Diveth Fear because we know he's been around a long time. He does a lot of, you know, he's an expert in a lot of things. You know, a very powerful mage. Was Fargoth. He's just looking for his fucking ring. I mean,
which is one of the things that bugs me immensely about some of the books. You've got some of them that are anonymous.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you've got some that you can make a reasonable stab at. Like I personally think that Vivek is the author of Sithis, for example. But for some texts, you just have no idea where they come from, so there's no real way of judging it as to whether it is or is not accurate, or any real context for what it goes. I mean, Varieties of Faith, for me, the reality of it all kind of leaks in, because Brother Mikhail Kruxigor of the Imperial College,
we know that name.
Yeah. I mean, I try to take, Imperial College, so this is probably something that's got a Cyrodiilic context, and is trying to link everything. Is trying to link everything to the divines, but at the same time, you think, can we link this to what Michael Kirkbride is thinking? Can we? Should we?
Well, even further in universe, I mean, almost anything from an imperial standpoint, we have to wonder how much of it's propaganda.
Oh yeah,
right.
For example, the Pocket Guide to the Empire.
Oh, so much of that.
That's, you know, there's lots. I mean, the whole bit about the Imga in Pocket Guide 3. I mean, it's they're just stupid monkeys and they pretend to be elves and they're not worth thinking about.
They like to wear clothes of elves and prance around like they're elves and stuff.
How stupid. I mean, they couldn't produce anything meaningful like a religious doctrine or anything, could they?
Yeah. Or notes on racial phylogeny and biology.
Oh, that's a good one.
Another good one. I mean, there's a lot of like racially charged things in there, implying that Argonians are pawn scum and orcs.
Why are my farm tools talking?
Orcs only live in caves, or
right.
I mean, it's a lot of that kind of thing, and so when thinking about whether to take a source seriously, I mean, there's so many different variables that you gotta kind of keep in mind, and so I mean, it's really a crap.
Right.
Exactly, Doc. It's like, so you're trying to tell us that Altmer don't practice infanticide? I mean, probably not. I mean, that's that like I'll put it to you this way. Personally, I like the idea of a race being that awful.
Yeah. And honestly, if it's going to be any of them, it's going to be Altmer. But
I don't know.
mean...
I would not be at all surprised if that didn't happen to other like races. Like, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there were certain like families in like Breton, in Bretonia that were like that were murdering children because they came out malformed or something.
Like a Chairman Mao's China sort of thing.
Yeah, or just like trying to keep up the purity of their bloodline, because there's a lot of families and politic that happen in Daggerfall that where like keeping your family strong is really important. So
yeah, I have some notes on
Nords this. Nords very like racially pure kind of Aryan kind of thing happening in depending on who's writing them, and you could easily stretch the Nords too far and turn them into Nazis, and really take anybody and stretch them too far and turn them into Nazis, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's the motto motto for the 2020s, isn't it?
Well, I was just about to say, just like that, we've already turned this into a discussion about Nazis. We're only on the internet for
I gotta add
56
that to
minutes. So
add that to the bingo card.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's inevitable.
Yeah.
And it's which, by the way, I mean, let me just say again, I've said it before, I'll say it again. I like the idea of not having good guy cultures in the Elder Scrolls. I like the idea that stretch anyone to the beginning. God damn it. And I like the idea of having every culture in the Elder Scrolls universe having something dreadful about them,
Yeah. It's realistic.
Yeah, well, it's realistic, but also it means that nobody's good. But similarly, and if nobody's good, then nobody's bad. And you can, and it's easier. It's more realistic that every culture has a dark side to it, and or at least I feel it is. So, but okay. So while we're discussing, like, maybe I guess have we hit everything that we kind of want to hit on? Who else has stuff they want to talk about? Because before we end, I want to compare and contrast this Unreliable Narrator to other settings like Lord of the Rings and stuff. So
we're not ending yet. No way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, we got good. Plenty.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So somebody say something smart.
I was going to drop a question in and say that do we apply the Unreliable Narrator to the games as a thing?
Yes.
I mean, you kind of have to, because otherwise the Imperial City only has 40 people living in it.
I got a quote for that, actually.
Otherwise, how many steps are there really to get up the side of that mountain? Yeah, to High Hrothgar. Yeah.
And that
either that or that was just. Well, I take that one as being proverbial almost.
Well, what's the quote? Did you find it?
Yeah, I got it right here.
Yep.
From Greg Keyes when he was writing the novels. Things are pretty wide open in terms of the story I could tell. I was given a preliminary outline of history after Oblivion, but I was also told that some of it was negotiable. There were a number of different short proposals, which were reviewed by my editor in the guise of Bethesda. Once the basic idea was settled on, I wrote a longer, more detailed outline, which then went through a few changes. All this process, I'd access to Bruce Nesmith and Kurt Coolman at Bethesda, so I could bounce ideas off of them, ask whether I could or couldn't do something. Of course, it had to be a TES story, so I was constrained by lore, although not, interestingly, by game mechanics. I was told specifically that no one wanted to hear the dice rolling, so to speak. We are to imagine the world of TES to be a real place, of which the games are merely representations. My book represents that world in another way. Geographical distances, for instance, are contracted in the game. In my books, they aren't. So it takes days or weeks rather than hours to run from one city to another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I mean that gets right into kind of the disparity between lore and the game representations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've always referred to the games as dioramas of the actual lore world. This kind of ideal, model that we have of the Elder Scrolls, and that model can kind of change from person to person based on what parts are taken more seriously through the lens of the Unreliable Narrator. So maybe we take this one little snippet from this book a little more seriously, this other person, no, I'm not sure I believe that because of this other source or whatever. I mean, there's so much room for interpretation.
It's still the eyewitness, but it's an unreliable eyewitness.
Yeah, I mean,
well, all eyewitnesses are unreliable. Ask any law enforcement officer.
Exactly.
Sure, yeah. And, I mean,
Right.
I mean,
that's a good thing to bring up.
I mean, the Imperial City should be miles across. Like that's like it's supposed to be this metropolitan center with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of inhabitants. But we get there and maybe 50.
Yeah,
right.
Including guards.
Imperial City should feel like New York.
Yeah, it should be thick.
Just without skyscrapers.
Actually, Doc points out something interesting, that the devs look at the real-time real world through a keyhole and try their best to recreate it for us. There used to be, I've mentioned this before on this cast, there used to be a thing that they were actually going to do. Bethesda was actually going to publish an article or something on one of their websites that's actually had a photograph that somebody had photoshopped of 3, I think, Elder Scrolls in somebody's basement, in their office building basement. And one of them was broken. And the idea was that they were going to suggest, as part of the Elder Scrolls world building that they were doing, that as a company, what they were doing, their suggestion was that they were reading these Elder Scrolls and using them to communicate with Daedra, who were then telling them what was going on in the world. And then they would create these video games to tell the stories to people on Earth, because that's what the Daedra wanted. The Daedra wanted people to experience these stories in the Elder Scrolls universe. And the way it was explained to me was that it was the Daedra were the investors in a project, and every time they made a video game, they had to bring them back to the investors, the Daedra, and the Daedra would ask them questions like, why is the Imperial City so fucking small? And they'd have to tell them, well, engine limitations, and we only had a certain amount of money for, product and so on. And then the Daedra would say something like, well, why isn't Levitate in the game anymore? And they'd say, well, we had to seal off we didn't want people flying over the building and would break the blah, blah, blah. And some of it is in fact backwards Esperanto. And that was and they, if I understand correctly, they still kind of throw around that idea at Bethesda of something that they're kind of jokingly that's what they're doing, is they're interpreting a real universe through the lens of stories that are told to them through these Elder Scrolls, and that every.
Well, and also by the same token, I mean, there are some gameplay elements that do end up influencing the lore.
Yes.
For example, the levitation thing, the levitation ban. I think that was kind of a clunky way to explain why levitation wasn't in the game.
Yeah.
But a good example I can think of is Creeper, who was initially added as a joke because Mark Nelson lost a bet to a friend.
That sounds right.
That was, according to what he said in the Polygon interview, like a year ago. He said that his friend was a drummer, so he added him as a scamp merchant who likes to bang on his drums, and that it was just whatever, and then we get dialogue from Barbas later on saying how he was pretending to be a scamp making deals with orcs. It's like, so is Creeper now
Barbas?
a part of the lore? Has that been Barbas the whole time? And so it's this really kind of fuzzy line. I wrote an article a few months ago about all this, just kind of examining the difference between lore and Easter eggs and mechanics and things. And I recommend people read it because shameless plug.
Because give me your internet points.
Well, if anyone's here who doesn't know about the Telmora Independent Press, then I'm surprised. But yes,
shame on you. Yeah.
If you don't, go and find TelmoraIndependentPress.net. It has some fantastic fan fiction in there and some brilliant opinion pieces.
Yeah, great art, terrific stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's one of the reasons why game mechanics changing over the years influences lore. The developers are also the writers, so they kind of throw in little inside jokes about where did spears go, that kind of stuff, and that's just that sort of adds to the concept of the unreliable narrator. But one of the things that somebody just pointed out a little while ago was the idea of a character in a well, all right, okay. So I think to sort of summarize a number of points, actually, is the question of who in the Elder Scrolls games is the narrator?
The world.
We are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would suggest that the player is.
The prisoner.
All
Yeah.
of the above.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the video game is a vehicle through which the player can tell his story.
Yep.
So the player's interaction with the medium, in other words, the video game, differs from the same guy can play Skyrim twice, and it's still going to be different. You know, they'll kill different people. They'll go do a different build. The first weapon they get will be different. The first piece of armor they put on will be different, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, Slove, you're a little fucking unreliable. And so you end up with this. The unreliable narrator of the Elder Scrolls games is the person who's experiencing it and the narrator. In that respect, and here's something to raise the hair on the back of the heads of all you Gnostics out there: the god of the Elder Scrolls games is experiencing himself subjectively.
Yes. I think
yes,
I could kind of agree with that.
Yeah.
Yes, we get back
Also,
to the only god I. Yes.
Yeah.
yeah. Also, that's good because I actually wanted to bring up as part of this cast a couple of points, if that's all right, if I may, right now. So earlier we were talking about the unreliable narrator and how some might be more unreliable than others for a variety of reasons. I would say that is true, but it is also worth remembering that we don't always know who is lying or who to trust, because we all probably have examples of this in our personal lives, and we have historic examples as well. If you're a huge sword nerd and you're reading the Book of Five Rings, how much of that is actually true and not just like Miyamoto Musashi stroking his proverbial sword, right? So there's all these different little examples that I'm sure people can find relevant to their interests or their personal experiences, which also brought me to the point of religion in terms of an unreliable narrator and faith. Now, I haven't had this conversation with Michael Ziegler yet, and I would love to pick his brain on this. But just as an example, I was not raised religious, but I was raised to be open-minded and to try and consider other viewpoints, and having lots of different people in my life, having extended Indian family who are of course practicing Hindus, having a lot of friends and family who are Catholic or Anglican, and having friends growing up who were Jewish, Muslim, atheist, Wiccan. You know, I've seen lots of different ways that people view their faith, the world, and creation. And I can't say that either one of them is particularly right or wrong, because everyone has their own viewpoint related to that. I, of course, have brought up with them that it can be kind of tricky sometimes in terms of, like, I get the whole faith argument that faith, by its very nature, means that you can't have all objective evidence. That's kind of what makes faith faith, and I get that. But at the same time, it makes me wonder, okay, so how do we actually know that these gospels are true or mostly true? How do we know that the Prophet Muhammad actually said and did these things, especially since the man, it's recorded, was illiterate, and you had his scribe writing things down? Well, how trustworthy was the scribe? Did the scribe miswrite something? These ancient Greek epics where it was all traditionally orally done, what got changed over the time that we don't know about, that was perhaps based on an actual true event? With regards to the Torah, I find is very fascinating because there's a lot of kind of inherent legalism in Judaism, which makes it very fascinating to me. So a lot of the times I've seen Jewish friends just arguing over interpretation of the Torah and the Talmud, and I think
Argue
that
with
is
them.
wonderful.
Yeah.
It's wonderful because that
Mhm.
again, that's within one religion. There's already this diversity of opinion and how to interpret something,
Right.
and they can all see the same thing and get a different view or perspective from it. And so I really wanted to be sure that we at least touched on this aspect without getting too, crazy about, oh, religion bad or religion is fantastic. Just to talk about it as probably something that is relevant to a lot of people personally, or at the very least is something that everyone should be familiar with because of upbringing, friends, family, or personal experiences, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to be sure that we touched on that before going further down the rabbit hole, as it were.
I think you brought up something interesting, in that when you raise the question, you have to ask how reliable this is, or ask about the factors.
Or the authenticity
Yes.
of, like, is this actually St. Gregory's finger or whatever it was, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
These relics, the authenticity of relics, for example.
That's kind of the answer, though, and how we kind of try to determine how reliable something is, because you're never able to tell 100%, even in real life, if something is 100% reliable or 100% unreliable. But what you do is use reason and deduction to
Mhm.
try to come to your own conclusions, and you form an argument based on that, so that we're not just sitting around wondering, oh my God, which one is it? Like forever.
Well, and I mean, from a scientific standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, we're as organisms, the human brain and its various things that it uses for sensory did not evolve to have a purely objective and complete perception of the world around it, because we are simply not. It's not possible. We can't do it.
Yeah.
We would not be able to contain. We would not be able to function. We wouldn't be able to, if we actually visually saw everything within our field of view and then had an organism in our heads to interpret that, it would be entirely dedicated to just visuals. And we would have a very narrow field of view because we would only be able to comprehend a very small number of things. And so without also having and one of the reasons why we are capable as organisms of problem solving and abstract thought is because we're able to reason with limited knowledge and reach a conclusion about something. If we were in fact biologically capable of understanding and perceiving everything completely around us, we would not have any reason to assume or logically conclude anything, because we would just look and there would be the answer. And so from that we would we gain from that limitation we gain the ability to move beyond that limitation and evolve as a species. So in other words, it's not a disadvantage that we cannot perceive truth. It's, well, we've made it not a disadvantage. Let me phrase it that way. The human race has evolved in a way to fight against that disadvantage and turn it into an advantage. Is it actually an advantage? Depends on whether or not we make it a million years from now. If we decide to go to war with ourselves and blow ourselves up. Yeah, right. I mean, the times are pretty grim right now, so the odds feel a little low, honestly. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, we've had a question from Slovakian in chat talking about how does this relate to mythopoeia?
Oh, who fuck knows?
Does it? I would almost personally say that it doesn't necessarily, or that it doesn't directly, or at least not how most people perceive mythopoeia. That you are talking about mythopoeia if you're talking about perception of gods in the Elder Scrolls at all, and the differences that are inherent in that, then that is what mythopoeia is. It's the making of myths that's put about a thing that's put a culture, and it's based on an imperfect view of that thing, which is why you get similar but related tales and so on. Mythopoeia, as a definition, as a word, is myth making. But what you're then doing in making those myths is impacting how your culture sees that god, which potentially could impact how the manifestations and so on and so forth. I'm personally not on the school of it actually impacts how gods work, that belief is something that gods need and are shaped by at all. But certainly the way that the stories are told impacts how they are seen in whatever context you're doing that sort of perception.
Well, it changes how gods might view themselves. Is the thing.
It
because
could do.
because mortals are components of gods.
Yes, and they are created for self-reflection. So yes,
it depends on, I think, which specifically for Elder Scrolls, it depends on which developer you're talking to. I think Kuhlman kind of takes that approach where the faith of the worshippers of a god can influence the god. Kirkbride, I think, goes the other direction, where he says that a god can choose to align to his followers, but that a god will exist whether, and honestly, certain dialogue in Morrowind kind of agrees with this, that the existence of a god is not dependent on whether he's worshipped or not, and that if there is a god out there who depends on his worshippers to exist, then he's not a god.
That's Earthbones versus Ancestors.
Yeah, exactly, versus Ancestors, and then also there's the the idea of can one kill a god? What was it a divine and intoxicating innocence? And that's sort of that's where one of the things that the Elder Scrolls universe hasn't really specifically stated as fact, in a way that we could take anything as fact.
Yeah.
Is what a god is and what the properties of a god are, and I doubt very seriously if we ever will, because again, that's something that frequently comes up in plot lines in Elder Scrolls games and adventures and stuff. So I don't think we're going to get a straight answer on that, because I think it's in the Elder Scrolls writers' best interest to keep things vague so that they have flexibility,
Yeah. It's too useful a narrative tool,
right?
For anything to be anything like that to be defined, because you can just flex and make it so that you now have a plot, which also makes me think. If we kind of want to go into the whole death of the author thing, which I think we're vaguely making our way towards.
It sounds like it.
It has now. I've brought it up.
Yay!
And we're going down that way. Is that how much do you want to treat those developer comments as accurate and reasonable ways of interpreting things? Because for starters, they're contradictory. I mean, the examples that everyone seems to bring up is Serana's age and the lifespan of elves.
Yeah.
Because nothing matches up. So should we, how do we interpret developer thoughts in relation to the games at all? Me personally, I treat them as another source to start thinking about. Does it match with everything else we know, and so on. So, which kind of colors how I think about quite a few of the unlicensed text, things like the new Mantia Intercept and so on, because quite a lot of those are just adding color to areas that we don't really have. So it's just shrug your shoulders, carry on, and just enjoy it for what it can give to you. But the instant you start thinking about different angles on things where we have things in the games that are contradicted and so on, then what does that mean? Do we just need to play and make it? And again, it comes back to making up our own reality, I suppose. That you just treat everything as a text. That to quote Derrida, there is no outside the text. So regardless of developer intention, do we start thinking, we meant it for it to be this way, and this is the fuller narrative outside of what was already published. How that should we start thinking about things as something that's distinct from that. I mean, are the authors themselves are inherently unreliable? Is I think possibly the conclusion that I'm wending my way towards here.
I have a
if you
quote
and
about that, yeah.
if you want to kind of claim that, and if you want to start digging into authorial intent, people who are trying to stick to a strict canon of the Elder Scrolls, unless you use very specific definitions of canon, then and very specific and potentially weird definitions, then if you're just sticking to the games, then you are or the games or published materials with a Bethesda copyright on it, then you are then you're in a way kind of killing off the author and just leaving the published works to hang, and there is even less kind of authoritative interpretations at all.
Yeah, and that's I mean, so one of the things that, like, well, in related to Death of the Author. So okay, so when you consider, again, pretty sure I'm right about this, but not 100%. When you consider the concept of the Death of the Author, the whole point, if I understand correctly, is that when you examine a work, a piece of art or story or video game, you examine just what's in it, and you do not take into account the way the author intends you to interpret it. And one of the reasons why this is a useful thing, especially in literature, is because some authors aren't very good. And sometimes they will write a story about something, and they will go out and say, I've written this story about my girlfriend and how much I love her. And a friend of theirs will read this story without hearing that and think, look at this lovely story my friend Bill the writer wrote about his mother. And they'll go back to Bill and they'll say, this is a great story about your mother. And Bill will say, fuck you very much. This is a story about my girlfriend. Are you out of your mind? I don't understand. How would you confuse one for the other? Yes, they're both named Tina.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yes, I only date women named Tina. I don't understand the point.
Sorry.
Yeah, and the reason why, if I understand correctly, Death of the Author sort of exists and is embraced by a lot of people, is that and why I consider it part of postmodernism and etc., is that it is not. It says that both people's interpretations of the story or anyone else's interpretation of the story is equally valid.
That's not really what it was trying to say.
No, I'm going to back that up. Yeah, but go ahead.
So actually, I have Roland Barthes, who actually wrote La Mort d'Auteur, which is the Death of the Author. Actually said this: it will always be impossible to know for the good reason that all writing is itself the special voice, consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is that neuter, that composite, that oblique, into which every subject escapes. The trap where all identity is lost, being the very identity of the body that writes. And while it's not necessarily untrue that like a reader has their own perspectives that alters the form of the meaning of the text, what he was actually trying to do, and what Foucault from his movement was actually criticizing him on, was erase the existence of the author and say that the only thing that matters is reading the text and the idea you get from it. Paul de Man actually, on top of that, went as far as to say that no human art has any meaning. It all means nothing, just because when there is no there's no origin to it, then and you can read whatever you want into it. Just it's all a monologue. You're all reading your own voice into everything over and over and over again. And that's, people have taken it to mean that there's multiple lines of interpretation that are intersecting here. And I think that's true. I think that's actually really true. But it's a way more reasonable version of what the destructuralists were actually trying to say. Barthes actually had to, because he kind of was getting the stink eye from so many people and was trying to say you can't psychoanalyze or properly review or critique anything, he actually in 1971 he had to write the return of the author, because he had to write a piece about how you can permit the author to return on your own terms.
Okay.
Because
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So he was basically saying that the author can say, this is what the purpose of this story is. And at that point, your interpretation of that, your review of that, I guess, of that piece might then be, well, he fucking failed because this is clearly about his girlfriend, his mother. But yeah. So at that point, the author does not become. It can only become irrelevant if they choose to be irrelevant. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's more like a sort of like a, not that the author dies, but they more like him a ghost in the text. One of the original mottos, actually, I think it was either Julian or Ted that coined this. Well, they didn't even coin it. They pulled it from some old Latin classical text, which was ars excellarum artem, which means that the true art is conceal art. And so part of this idea is that you conceal the artifice of creation, the signs that you have built this, so that it looks like it has more life to it, and that there's more of a reality to it.
And it's also, just to clarify that a bit more, in terms of, I think Deadite might understand a bit better, is also the act of making it look effortless, to move without moving. It's the same thing.
I was just thinking, this is sort of like the difference between like a really well programmed game and a really badly programmed game, where the really badly or I should say not necessarily programmed, but certainly engineered, where a badly engineered game, arguably, you can see the gears turning in the background, like debug information pops up on the screen or something, and you know you're playing a game. You know, it doesn't immerse you into this reality. But arguably, I say arguably because some people like that shit. Some people are just like, hey, I want to know what the math was on my to-hit calculation because I'm pretty sure I just got robbed. You know, there are a lot of XCOM players who feel me on that. And so there's and so like arguably a well executed game by that definition, or well executed literature would be one that you read it and you think this, and you don't feel the author in it at all, I guess.
It's more like the author goes out of his way to make himself invisible, but he never stops being there. Like if you read, like you compare any work of great literature, you can tell the difference in feel between different writers. And like how they do things. So they're still there, but it's more like they make themselves more of a platform for the discussion of ideas. T.S. Eliot wrote about how the author should labor to become a medium rather than a person, just because you entertain ideas you don't necessarily hold, or that you might debate or discuss. So you take all these experiences in plethora and make it the tapestry upon which you write, and that makes you more of a medium in the story, not a personality.
Which I think has definitely happened for Kirkbride.
Yeah, I was about to say, a lot of fiction writers will frequently talk about how, and Kirkbride has said this about Vivek, about how when he's writing Vivek, he's not writing Vivek, he's just letting Vivek talk through him. And that's and that's what a lot of fiction writers will say that about. Like I was reading some article about like how to write really good dialogue, and one person was quoted as saying something along the lines of, "Don't write good dialogue. Don't try to write good dialogue. Just try to let the character talk through you, and the dialogue will be good." And I was like, that's not what I was looking for.
Well, I mean, and that's a similar thing with like, you know, like Dungeons and Dragons. If you're role playing your character, you're not making choices for your character if you're doing it right.
Yeah,
you know?
You're facilitating the character to make choices.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things before we get too wrapped up, because we've been doing this for about an hour and 20 minutes now.
Yeah, it's an hour and 8.
A couple things. Would it be okay for everyone here if I make a recommendation for a really good series of YouTube videos that talk about the death of the auteur theory, like all this stuff? Okay. So there's a YouTuber called Lindsay Ellis.
Yes.
I know of her, yeah.
Yeah, and when
I just showed a link in
okay,
Twitch.
It's in
cool.
chat. Okay, good. Yeah, all right.
Perfect. Because yeah, she has several very well very thoroughly explained
Yeah, she goes for half an
episodes
hour.
about these topics that we're talking about, and I think she also went to school for stuff like this.
Yeah, she went to film school.
And there's often a good bit of humor in there as well. So
Yeah.
I enjoy it, and
she's funny.
I remember brushing up on these before we started doing this. This was kind of my homework. So I wanted to bring that up, but I also want to bring up something on the subject of the Elder Scrolls and the Unreliable Narrator. Is another example from Oblivion that has always stuck with me is this particular quote by Haskell. And I have it pulled up here. So when you talk to Haskell at some point, I think about Mehrunes Dagon and the invasion of Cyrodiil, Haskell says, "How typical. You mortals love to take a pebble of information and construct entire realms of conjecture upon it. Your lore of those disparate beings that you lump together as Daedra is based on nothing. Lies and half-truths told by traitors, rebels, miscontents, and weaklings who have had the misfortune to become involved with mortals, or with Mehrunes Dagon. Do not speak his name to me again, the master of scum, the pawn of every prince of true power, the dupe of every schemer in the 19 voids. Do you think that you know anything of the politics, factions, feuds, vendettas, wars of Oblivion? Do you think Oblivion's such a simple place that the tale of the loyalties of a great people such as the Mazkin could be encompassed in a brief tale?" And I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that shows, like, on the one hand, how trustworthy is he, because he's clearly in a position as someone who's, I guess, depending on your view of it, subservient to or equal to a powerful Daedra Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So he's coming from that angle. But at the same time, he raises up the good point, especially that first little sentence about building entire, like taking a pebble of truth or information and constructing entire realms of conjecture upon it.
Yeah.
And I feel that we do that a lot, especially with, the slightest thing of, whoa, like, what do the bug jars mean? Is it secretly a conspiracy? Like,
Oh, yeah.
We'll take a tiny little thing and it's, whoa! So
bloodline recorded by Coda.
Yeah. Oh, remember he turns into water when people die. Yeah. It's inferring detail and it's inferring meaning in things devoid of detail. That's what we do. And
damn, Haskell figured us out.
Yeah. Oh no. It me IRL. Yeah. So.
This motherfucker spitting.
So what we had was what I wanted to talk about before we close up was contrasting this unreliable narrator system with or philosophy with universes that do not embrace this philosophy, and which means it's time for me to do my favorite thing, which is talk shit about Star Wars. So the
you and me go talk later.
Oh no, I have more compliments than anything else. But
I was going to say Michael isn't here to defend Star Wars.
Well, what I'm doing is I'm talking shit about Star Wars fandom. And one of the things that and also I'm going to talk a little bit of shit about Harry Potter fandom too.
Oh yeah.
When you have the opposite of an unreliable narrator, which is a narrator from the God perspective, or a truth, in other words.
Third person omniscient.
Yeah.
Basically.
You have, in my opinion, it only introduces leaks in the hull of the boat, basically. If one of the advantages that the Elder Scrolls universe has is that they can take a whole damn province and turn it from a jungle into Hobbiton and give that to gamers and then give them the vaguest explanation for why this has happened, and it still works. You can still say, you give the gamers the opportunity of saying, that's horseshit, or, yeah, all right, fuck it, why not? And and because you've built it on a basis of the unreliable narrator, it holds up. But if J.K. Rowling said Harry Potter was actually a woman, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say that that I think one of the other reasons for accepting the games as a thing is that certain, for the kind of argument you're making, you have certain things that have epistemic privilege that that you've got, that the games are the biggest source of information that we have, so we naturally kind of lean towards the games as the thing. It's the same with Rowling and Harry Potter, that she's quite happy to put post hoc explanations in that that say that Dumbledore was gay. That I can't remember what any of the other ones are. I mean, I think there are the seeds in there that would suggest that in the actual text, but and there are some other ones that are a lot weaker that she's since made.
Well, I think another one is that wizards historically have never used toilets. They just poop their pants and then magic the poop away.
Yeah.
Which really, like, well, yeah. But so one of the points is that when you have a single authority of absolute truth in a universe, there are two weaknesses that show up. The first one is that person can change their mind. That's a fucking problem, and that's exactly what we have with Star Wars. We had a huge list of canonicity, of levels of canonicity, of levels of truth, as if truth can be more truthy than something else, which is
within an object fiction to begin with.
Well, okay, but one of the things that Star Wars and works of fiction in general try to do is emulate reality. And that means that they're attempting to emulate whatever it is, an objective truth or similar. So, yes, the fans allocated on their own things into various levels of truth, but generally speaking, what was considered to be absolute canon was anything in one of episodes 4, 5, and 6. And when episodes 1, 2, and 3 came out, we either found out new things that didn't really jive with episodes 4, 5, and 6.
Midichlorians.
Or why didn't C-3PO recognize certain people? And when you end up with that situation, you have the second problem that I have. The first one being that the author can change their mind, which is what happened in a lot of cases with Star Wars. But also the author can fuck things up. And if the author fucks something up, like why didn't C-3PO recognize people, or why the hell did they never mention midichlorians in episodes 4, 5, and 6? Similar. You end up in a situation where the author has two options. The author can either ignore it, which is what George Lucas did, or try to explain it away in that primary source in a movie, so that there's going to be like a little bit of dialogue between two characters where somebody just throws out the explanation that that resolves supposedly the conflict. You still end up in a situation where you're going to have hardcore nerds are gonna examine every little fucking facet of absolutely everything and are gonna go, no, that doesn't fucking hold up.
I mean, hello, have you met us?
Right, literally my job. Okay, so one of the advantages that the unreliable narrator has, and this is going to speak to one of the points in the document, is that it supports itself by remaining flexible, by not delivering an absolute truth theoretically at any given point. You can contradict yourself. The universe can contradict itself and explain it away as, well, that was a story told by somebody else, or that was a lie that we told to you in the Pocket Guide to the Empire. The Cyrodiil was never a jungle. Forget that shit, or it was a metaphor. It was a jungle in air quotes, or whatever. And, you know, of course, Altmer don't kill their babies. What are you, fucking nuts? You know, you can
Although
do.
the ancient Spartans did.
Well, yeah. So you can. Thank you, Seth. It's straight fire, I'm sure. And when you have that flexibility, the entire universe becomes by becoming less believable because you have more. You know, you have to contend with lies and ignorance. It actually becomes more believable because now the universe can have a consistency of inconsistency. As was pointed out by somebody in the document, is this a crutch for bad writing? And that's,
I mean, technically, yes.
It can be. Yeah, it absolutely can be.
Like,
but
should
like,
it be?
as a flat general statement, I don't know, but it definitely often is.
I mean, it's a device. It's a device like anything else. I mean,
right.
you can use, you know, like what's a good example? Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway. I mean, that's almost all dialogue. You could say, oh well, dialogue is just a way for him to avoid exposition, but that's why it's a brilliant piece of writing. Because he uses dialogue to show exposition.
Something that Jorge Luis Borges does is he'll write. It's one of my favorite things that he does. He writes a review of a book that doesn't exist. So instead of writing the book that he wants to write, he'll realize, Jesus, that's a lot of work, and I'm not really that dedicated to it. I'm not saying that this is what he did, but like, but in my case at least, when I do it, he thinks that's a hell of a lot of work. I don't want to write this whole thing. I'm just going to write somebody reviewing the story that I wish existed. And then I'll get across the points that I wanted to get across anyway, and I don't actually have to do all the work, you know? It's one of the reasons why I think sometimes Kirkbride decides to write a script for something. Is because the advantage of writing a script is you could just write dominantly dialogue and then tiny little descriptions of things, and saves you a shitload of time. And you just get to do the fun stuff, which is people talking to each other. And your fight scenes can just be like a little paragraph explaining, roughly speaking, directions for an artist on how to visualize it, and then you're basically done. I'm not saying that Kirkbride writes scripts to be lazy, but I'm saying if I wrote scripts, it would be because I was being lazy. Yeah, it was the Hidden Fortress. You're right. Yeah. So, yeah, is the unreliable narrator in the Elder Scrolls universe an excuse for bad writing? It can be used as an excuse for bad writing. I'm not so naive as to say that the Elder Scrolls games do not have bad writing in them. You're gonna find them. I'm not that big of a fan of some of the books out there that I've read. 2920 is good, but I think it drags in places. And
I like an Argonian account better.
I'm a bigger fan of Lusty Argonian Maid, so you know what I'm gonna do.
The Lusty Argonian Maid.
That's my shit right there.
That's a modern masterpiece. Oh, I couldn't finish that.
You couldn't do it seriously.
Like, I actually did a dramatic reading of the sultry Argonian Bard.
Ooh.
The other day, just because every time I talk to my friends, and you know, like they're like, "Oh, you're into Elder Scrolls lore stuff. You know about the Lusty Argonian Maid?" Every time, like the last 5 years.
Well, it's the only book in the games, so yeah. And that's and so, you know, part of you could theoretically, nobody's done it none of the authors in the Elder Scrolls games have done it yet, but it is entirely possible that they could do something really dumb and then turn around and go, well, you know, unreliable narrator.
They don't even need to go unreliable narrator. They just need to go Kalpa.
Yeah, it's magic. I ain't got to explain shit. Yeah.
LJ, Ice Fire Warden, actually pointed out a weakness in this methodology, though, that I noted that I'd never really thought about the other day, because something that's going on with ESO is they're now starting to bring back characters they've previously killed, invalidating player choice. So what's happened is, because they keep clinging to unreliable narrator to the point that they want to maximize player choice, they've written themselves into corners that they're now being forced to infringe on the choices that they did allow.
Right.
So it's an interesting thing that I never thought about, but you do tend to write your way into corners when you rely on the unreliable narrator too much.
That's why we have Deus Ex Machina.
Well,
it's
that
because they're trying to keep recurring characters in the narrative as well, because it's the type of stories they want to tell.
Yeah.
I also think they're going off data that they have, because they've logged player choices to a vast degree. So if you're talking about bringing characters back, I think around 80% of the playthroughs that have done it have killed the profit off. So
I totally did.
So bringing back Sai Sahan and Lyris isn't actually doing that much. It's kind of damage limitation in some ways, because
I mean, it's at least they acknowledge that that's. I mean, oh yeah, I died. I don't really know how I came back, but here I am. So it's like
writing,
it's yeah. I mean, it's like they're acknowledging it by
hand waving it.
By being vague about it. So we don't know the mechanics of how it worked. Well, I think Lyra says something about how like the gods weren't done with me yet or something, and so they sent me back. Like, that's a little.
I'll put it to you this way:
was she Lyris the White?
Yeah. I am Lyra as she was meant to be. It's
Anyway.
Does that bring you comfort? So
that took me a second.
Yeah. What I think, personally for me, when I heard that they were bringing those characters back from the dead, I just sort of, I mean, like, I've read enough comic books to know, I mean, nobody dies, you know? I mean, I just decided, I just sort of went, oh, okay, that's how we're going to do it. Okay, whatever. I mean, you know.
People do die, but then they bring them back in an alternate universe.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And, well, I mean, but they do and they don't. I mean, there's, you know, whatever. I mean, I watched 80-odd billion seasons of G.I. Joe where nobody got shot ever. So, you know, planes got blown up and people bailed out every time.
It kills my immersion, man.
Ridiculous.
I want to be completely immersed in G.I. Joe.
Yeah, I need my G.I. Joe lore to be consistent.
Give me that authentic PTSD. Come on.
Yeah.
Go, Joe.
So it's so I mean, I have not yet seen a truly egregious violation of logic and sanity in the you know, for the purposes of writing in Elder Scrolls Online, at least. In fact, I would probably say that turning Cyrodiil into a verdant plain was probably the grossest thing I'd ever seen, because in the game they didn't explain it. And they actually gave you, I think that you can find Pocket Guide to the Empire 1 in the game, can't you? Or like there's an in-game document? No? Okay, yeah. It seemed to... I thought I remembered something about there actually being an in-game document in Oblivion that actually calls Cyrodiil a jungle, but whatever.
There's the Red King once jungled.
No, but that's Skyrim.
But in Skyrim, that was a reference to something Kirkbride wrote from the Oblivion era, which was a reference to something he wrote in Mankar's commentaries.
The Red King once jungled.
Witness the home of the Red King once jungled. Mankar Cameron Diaries, whatever.
Yeah. And it's
Mysterium Xarxes, I think.
It was commentaries on Mysterium Xarxes. And,
it was the commentaries on it. That's it.
And so what they had, the fact that they hadn't bothered to explain that, really just kind of meant to me that they figured nobody had actually read the book and gave a shit. And then when you saw the reaction that the forums had, when the first trailer and screenshots and stuff for Oblivion came out, it was a huge amount of what the hell. And because you weren't allowed to cuss, and they had like a huge reaction to it, and I don't think we actually got I don't think any of the developers really said much about it. I think somebody was saying something. Somebody at one point or another, like Kuhlman or somebody, said like, "Yeah, well, we didn't want to have a whole game take place in a jungle."
Did the transcription error excuse come from?
No, that was Zenimax.
That was Schick. That was Schick.
That was actually, it was before Schick.
Okay.
It was the transcription error. I think I'm ready to be contradicted, but I believe that happened before Schick, and then they got Schick on board, and Schick came out with the towers
I mean, Schick
thing.
seems to think it was his inclusion.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he because when I interviewed him a few months ago, he said, "Oh yes, transcription error, one of my more felicitous
really?
contributions to lore."
Is that
That's
guy
I wanna
a
hear
living
this man
thesaurus?
speak.
What the fuck?
No,
Oh, yes, he is.
dude's brilliant, and
Yeah.
he's hilarious too.
Yeah, I'm
And
sure
we
he
have
is.
He's a riot.
Yeah.
We have an answer on which book it was from LJ in chat. It was Provinces of Tamriel,
Okay.
which describes Cyrodiil's jungle.
It describes in Oblivion. In Oblivion, it describes Cyrodiil's jungle. Yeah. Okay.
Very cool.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no. The reason you're thinking Pocket Guide to the Empire is because dialogue from the Savants in Morrowind quote the Pocket Guide to the Empire in saying Cyrodiil is mostly endless jungle.
Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Yeah, and I actually remember while we're kind of carrying on this, note that's so far off now, Unreliable Narrator and stuff. I remember, I think it was like some early description, perhaps it was on a forum or maybe it was even Kirkbride himself who was describing it, but the way that I first had the Imperial Province in my mind was kind of like Southeast Asia, like the Mekong Delta, this waterways, all these houses on stilts, but there's this big, giant, golden, impressive Angkor Wat kind of city in the middle.
Yep.
There's all these kind of old pyramids, which were going to be like the old alien ruins, and then that's where you got the Roman influence built on top of that, sort of reclaiming, like, mankind builds upon these elven monuments. And
right.
That would have been like some cool dungeon exploring areas, and it felt so cool in my head. and then I see like this Lord of the Rings clone, and you literally have to fight Satan in hell. I'm like, but then all the quests were actually amazing.
They're really good though.
Quests,
they're so good.
That was actually another article I wrote. I was kind of critical on how Bethesda would kind of follow trends, which I mean I get from a financial perspective, like it makes sense to do what's going to be popular and sell well, but I think at the end of the article I said they have enough weight to throw around that they could influence the entire genre instead of being.
Well, what do you think happened with Skyrim? Yeah, exactly. Skyrim kickstarted. Well, Skyrim, I think, in my opinion, Skyrim kind of kickstarted Nordic, focus in nerds in America at the very least. Before Skyrim came out, people were good on Nords, but before Skyrim came out. But after Skyrim came out, man, mead people were like making fucking money hand over fist, man. It was like you couldn't keep mead in a store.
I mean, from a stylistic standpoint, though, I mean, it was kind of in vogue to have games and other media where the entire color palette is akin to a bowl of oatmeal. Like it's just browns and grays, and it's dusty, and I mean, we see that with like. A little bit in New Vegas, and
I
mean, we've
you best behave yourself. I love New Vegas.
Oh no,
it's a great game. I'm not criticizing it at all.
Good.
But then we've also got Game of Thrones and how a proclivity for falling snow and just shades of gray everywhere, and I mean,
washing all the contrast out. Yeah,
it's all kind of parallel, and so
Fallout 3 where everything was green all the time.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it?
And then you got Fallout 76, which is every color of the rainbow.
Yeah, well, I mean, see, I made another.
No one plays it though.
Oh, fucking I do. It's a fun game.
Okay,
don't play it too hard. Don't play it too seriously, but it's great. Yeah. Well, I don't. I can understand that, but.
Yeah, because I basically pointed out that Morrowind was just so kooky and out there, and it was different from anything else present in the genre at the time, and that was a major contribution to success.
Yeah.
And then we get Oblivion, and it's like, okay, well, now we're getting generic Western Europe with knights and horses and horse armor. and then we get let's see. No, I don't want that. on. I'm looking for. Oh yeah. So HBO laid out Planets of Grey television series based on A Song of Ice and Fire. And the first episode was aired in April 2011.
Mm-hmm.
That's like 6 months prior to the release of Skyrim.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, a lot of the aesthetic choices are probably already made, but we're seeing kind of a pretty clear lineage here.
The aesthetic, like if you look straight in the concept art though that existed before that show came out, you can see that the models are heavily and textures are heavily based off of those. They went really strongly with Adamowitz's and the other guy, I can't remember his name's like design for that. I don't really think, I think that was more weird timing.
Because I mean, we've got kind of the gritty, shameless realism. We got the grays and browns of a wilder and darker fantasy genre. Ancient and thought to be mythic dragons and a strange preoccupation with falling snow.
That's what Americans are buying. That's the thing. That's like,
So
I've had a lot of arguments
buying
with
Canada with dragons.
Does that mean then, just to deliver things vaguely back into topic? Does that mean that we need to start because everything is so of its time? Does that mean that for it to actually be accurate to the lore, that we need to start thinking about it absent of those trends? That there's actually something else underneath it.
I think sometimes you do have to do that.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose because I mean, part of the if you start taking in the whole "there's nothing outside of the text" kind of stuff, that's probably a better way to experience these games, is to not think about what was trendy at the time and why, and allow that to not, color your absorption of the material. But I think some people might actually appreciate that. I mean, if you're doing, for example, an 80s themed video game, you're going to want to bring in parts of 80s themed culture. I mean, I know that's not what Elder Scrolls games ever are. They're not themed after a real life thing, but
I get what you're saying.
Yeah, sometimes that can assist in your enjoyment of some material. I just don't think that the Elder Scrolls games are necessarily what you want to do. What universe is Morrowind in? I don't fucking know.
Morrowindle.
Oh, Morrowindle.
Yeah, it's literally they took the name from somewhere else entirely and just chopped the L off.
Yeah.
But that reminds me of something that Lady Nerevar said a while back, that the representations of things we're seeing in the games are a cipher for things in the lore, right down to the Imperials looking Roman. They are coding that for people's expectations of empire rather than what it actually looks like.
There is such a thing as cultural shorthand in visual media, which we do have to be at least aware of. Like we see, for example, let's take Game of Thrones for instance. There's a lot of cultural shorthands for what's expected of marriage and things because it's a reflection of Western feudal society that we had in history at that point in time. Marriage ceremonies, how people talk to each other, how the tone someone could have with someone in a lot of Western cultures could be cultural shorthand for, oh, we know this guy is a sleazy car salesman, or he's a douche, or he's a spy master, or he's
I'd sell my sister if I had one.
Yeah, like we exactly. That's actually a really great example, right? That's a cultural shorthand because we've all seen something in media that's like that, right? Even though someone's speaking, like having these people from Cyrodiil speaking with American accents doesn't make a lot of sense for any in-game thing, especially if the root of the languages involved are supposed to be of a more Latin orientation. Imperials should be more like Italians, but they're not because, again, cultural shorthand and resources that you had available to you. So it is something that we have to keep in mind, because otherwise if you try and analyze things and make sense of, well, wait, why do they speak this? How are all these languages different? You're not going to be able to make sense of it.
The reason why everybody in Skyrim sounds like Yeah, everybody in Skyrim sounds like some regional variation on Germanic, is because that's what people expect.
Bar.
Yeah.
Barbarians.
So, anyway, I think we spiraled way off of subject enough to call it.
Yeah, definitely now.
Yes.
You guys want to talk about what we're doing next time?
Don't we still have some like gods to cover, like Finaster,
Really
Trinimec,
should do like another
Magnus?
slow cast because of the quarantine.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Oh,
like,
so we
Thracian
can talk about
Plague
Thracian
Edition,
Plague,
oh
yeah.
my
Like
God,
Periite
yes.
and like disease in general.
I could do a Periite cast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
kind of
Okay,
fun.
we could do
We
Periite,
need
Thracian
we need
Plague.
LJ on board if we're doing a Periite.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's no way I'm doing Periite without Icefire Warden on board. So yeah,
Yeah.
we'll
Okay, so
coordinate
let's see
with
if we
him.
can get it.
You're
Yeah.
We can
muted,
do that.
Andrew.
I am
Mhm.
muted. I realized that my dog
Yeah.
kept fucking barking.
And Andrew can fill us in on like the Slode and the Thracian Plague.
Oh
Mhm.
yeah.
Yep.
And we can probably throw in, I don't know, a little extra.
What about the Nahat flu?
Mhm.
That's the one. I was
Yeah.
thinking, yeah.
Notten is the K silent. Yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think.
So we'll do a disease cast.
Yes.
Sweet,
All right.
perfect.
All right, everybody, we go back.
Before we go,
What?
the Selectives Lorecast is now an actual podcast. You
Yay!
can find it in podcatchers now, people.
It's all this guy's fault right down here. He's doing all the actual work. So
Yeah.
he gets all the credit.
The first episode of the cast is out. The second one is coming out tomorrow if you're listening to this live.
Yeah.
Like first episode from years back. Like
Yes.
before
Yeah.
I was even a thing.
The unreliable narrator.
Yes.
So in a way,
so
this
we're
is an
starting a new
anniversary
Kalpa.
episode. Yeah, a little bit. All right, yeah.
Yeah, so we're starting a new Kalpa. That's what this is. All right,
Yes,
cool.
absolutely.
Sure, we'll go with that.
But yes, that's out. You can find it pretty much everywhere, unless you want to go for somewhere horribly esoteric. But yeah, we have
Mhm.
Cast 2, which I think is LJ talking about the Daedra.
I remember that cast.
Coming out tomorrow.
Okay. All right, folks.
Yeah.
Everybody wave.
Have fun.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.